Welcome back. Hope that you all like the lunch. And I'm very honored to introduce this conversation between Pietro. Pietro Rigeriva is co-founder of Santa Ragione, an Italian independent studio, and also of the game development collective Contralto, which is doing pretty interesting thing in narrative kind of games. And the conversation will be with Rhianna Pratchett. Rhianna is an award-winning game writer and writer from television and comics. She worked on a lot of AAA games such as like Mirror Edge and the Tomb Raider series. She's really super awesome, and she advocates a lot to have a bigger interest in writing in games and a bigger importance in story and storytelling, which I think is really, really important. So without further ado, I just leave them to have this nice conversation. Thank you very much.
All right. So welcome everybody for coming, and thank you for being here. It's an honor to be interviewing one of the most accomplished and respected writers of our industry. And like, for those of you who weren't familiar with her name, Rhianna is the writer on the Overlord series, as well as Thief 2014, the latest two Tomb Raider, so Tomb Raider 2013 and Rise of the Tomb Raider, as well as co-writer on Heavenly Sword and Bioshock Infinite. Am I correct?
Yeah, I had quite a minor role on Bioshock Infinite.
Okay. So looking at your portfolio, starting from there, like my first question would be like, what is it like? What is the difference between working on a new IP versus working on such like famous and established IPs such as Thief and Tomb Raider?
I mean, I don't really talk about Thief that much because it was such a favourite IP of mine. Okay. I was a big fan of the first two games, the second one in particular.
Of course.
It was actually the only project I fought to get an interview for. And okay. It was a bit of a disastrous development
but it's not because of you, it's like the development was...
the development of the last Thief game was a bit disastrous, and I wasn't really involved in the last year, so I was only involved for a part of it, and then sort of there was a lot that happened that I wasn't involved in. So yeah, it didn't really turn out in the way that I would have hoped. But yeah, it sort of... Yeah, that was a big shame because I was such a big fan and a big fan of Garrett as a character. And it was really nice to be able to kind of work in that world and create a lot of stories for that world. And a lot of stuff sort of didn't get into the game. And there were kind of a lot of team changes. And so that was a difficult one. With Tomb Raider, because they were rebooting it, it sort of felt a little bit like a new IP in that there was more room to maneuver. It wasn't quite a blank slate that we started with, because we were sort of drawing on old Lara kind of influences and across the two games as well. So we were always trying to draw out classic Lara things like the twin pistols or Croft Manor. Right. Yeah, and so we were always going to sort of draw them out. We just didn't want to sort of put everything in the one game. So when I came to Tomb Raider, Crystal Dynamics already had quite a good idea of what they wanted to do and what there was scope to change. And they'd already done quite a lot of work that was changing what we'd seen before, such as the look of her, for example. And they were just very open to my suggestions. And I really wanted to kind of explore the humanity within the hero more and kind of give her a grounding in our world a little bit more, because she is pretty much a superhero, and
you used to be.
Well, she is. Because all kind of protagonists in that kind of game are, because they can actually defy. Right. Even though we try and make it look like they can't, they can still like heal by crouching behind a wall and things like that. It's sort of superhero stuff, but in a very gamey way. So I do kind of think of her as a sort of low-level superhero. But I kind of wanted to explore humanity, how you go through the world when you spend a lot of time rescuing people and fighting bad dudes, and how that sort of changes interactions with your friends as well. And that's something that I carried through in the comics as well. So there were 3 arcs of the comics with Dark Horse that took place between the first and second game. So Gail Simone worked on the first one, Gail and I worked on the second, and I worked on the third, and we spent a lot of time in those sort of exploring her relationships and friendships and how those kind of entwined with her adventures. And that was what was kind of most interesting to me, was kind of exploring the lighter side of Lara in some ways. So
the lighter.
The lighter, yeah. Okay. Because you need light to define the darkness. And you know,
and do you think that's what changed between the first Tomb Raider reboot compared to Rise of the Tomb Raider?
I think the previous Tomb Raiders had a lot of lightness and humor in them in a way that the games didn't have so much of. But that was a choice that Crystal made. Like, they didn't want her to have the quippy one-liners that she used to have. And I would have been very, very happy to write those, but they kind of wanted her kind of more serious, and they felt that the quippy one-liners suggested that she was confident and too confident, and she isn't, and so that they felt that wasn't right for who she was at that time. She's a little bit more like classic Lara in the comics, I think. So I could get a little bit more humor in there.
I was asking you about lighter because having played through them, they felt like very dark.
Yeah, there's
games.
A lot of dark. There's a lot of dark. I think it's darker in some ways. Just by the kind of the type of action, and because it had moved into more of a shooter and less of a puzzler. I think the puzzles are kind of brought back more in Rise. There was a lot of darkness, and there's a high level body count. But we also wanted to explore things, and we touch upon in the game and expand it through the comics and into the second game of kind of her friendships and how they, you know, what those mean. And obviously her friendship with Sam, her best friend, is central to her motivation for the first game, and that sort of continued through in the comics with sort of other characters coming in there.
And speaking about this sort of like contrast between the storytelling and the gameplay, and I don't know if you can answer this, but how was it when you had to concede things to the gameplay programming, gameplay design team in regards to what was happening on screen in terms of action? Like, they would say something like, there's a lot of dangerous situations because we need the QTEs, we need the fighting, put that into the story, and you would be like pushing back and be like, well, what if we develop the characters more in this direction? Was there something that was happening?
I mean, there's always fights between gameplay and narrative, because the needs of narrative and the needs of gameplay aren't always aligned, and what might be fun for the player to play is not necessarily what needs to happen with the character. And Lara's first kill is a kind of good example of that, and a battle that happened. And, you know, narrative wanted the ramp up with her first kill, which is sort of very impactful, and you know, she's sort of sickened and very upset by it. We wanted the ramp up between that moment and her, you know, talking to another person about that moment, and then having to go on to kill other people. We wanted a much slower ramp up between that. And I think originally the gameplay put 32 kills in between her killing for the first time and her speaking to Roth about it, her kind of mentor figure character.
So she got used to it very quickly.
Yeah, it's just like she's kind of given about 5 seconds and then she's off again. And it was something that narrative did kick back against, and I think we got it reduced to about 16, but the problem was that, you know, the playtesters were like, but you've given us a gun, we want things to you know, shoot the gun at, and because that's how we're kind of conditioned to think as gamers. You get a weapon, you get something to, you know, to hit with, and, you know, it was, and narrative knew that we were going to get criticised for that kind of fast ramp up, and we did get criticised for that fast ramp up. But I think, you know, hindsight is always 20/20, and I think I would have liked to have seen there be more consideration of maybe other things that she could have done in that ramp up. Like just explore, like her throwing the gun over a cliff or something like that, which would be frustrating for the player, but it would be perfectly in line with how her character was.
Right.
And then she'd have to maybe go a little bit further without using a gun or just using a bow, and then she's got to pick up a gun again and then carry on from there.
Like, I would have loved it as a narrative game player, but I can already imagine like the reviews on Metacritic being like, "Oh, she lost the gun. This game sucks. So boring until she starts shooting again."
Well, I don't know. I think players might have been forgiving. I think it's just about how you pace it. I think, it's kind of all down to pacing. If you can introduce some kind of fun scenario that she could be engaged in that didn't necessarily have a weapon, and she goes for the first section of the game without a weapon when she's in the cave. So, and then you've got the bow and arrow, and I know a lot of players that actually just continued with the bow and arrow through most of the game because they felt it was more Lara.
Yeah, also they advertised the game as a bow and arrow character.
Yeah, and that's genuinely in her backstory. So she had an archery club when she was at university, so that was actually something she could do before she got to the island.
Rather than being a very good gun woman as she ends up being in the final game, right? And that brings me directly to Mirror's Edge, because there the story is very different, right? Mm-hmm. Although I've read that when you got to the project, most of the gameplay for that game was already done. Mm. So how did that one go?
I mean, this is the kind of peculiarity of games development, really. Everything was done with no narrative in mind. So the world looked like the way it did because they thought it was a cool aesthetic. They didn't think about why it looked like that, which is where you start as a writer, but you don't necessarily have to start that way as an artist. All the gameplay had been designed, but no one had really thought, like, why is she moving through the world like this? Why does the world look like that? Why is she dressed like this? How does all the why questions? And so I had to go in and retrofit the story back through what was there, which is, it's very backwards way of working compared to any other entertainment medium where you're always script-led. But I've never found one where they just designed everything and no one had thought about why. And so I had to, I think what we managed to sort of get in there was, helped hold up the world. But it would have been much better if, I'd been there early on and I could have helped build that with them instead of having to, just sort of be a narrative paramedic, really.
Well, I don't know if you're very lucky or just extremely talented, but this is something that surprised me a lot when I read about it, that the game was there before the story, because it fits so well and also ends up being a very original story, because compared to many other games where the bad guys are really evil and bad, while I was playing through Mirror's Edge, I got this very interesting idea that these rebels are fighting against a government that isn't explicitly evil aside from how they control communication. So it's more like on principle basis that they are fighting against this thing. So how did you end with that concept instead of like doing Half-Life where they just like kill everybody? They're evil government people.
It was kind of just the idea that potentially a government could get citizens to give up their certain rights and freedoms for a kind of more comfortable life, a more safe life. I think it's Irvine in California that's a city that's pretty much run by a company. And it was just kind of extrapolating by those ideas and thinking, okay, what if it was just like a nanny state taken to extremes, but kind of in a city, and like it's actually a pretty nice and a safe place for the citizens, and it's just the extreme nanny state. It's very high surveillance. But what you see of the shining city is actually only one part of it. In the comics, comics tend to be where I put everything that I can't fit in the game. So I wrote the original prequel story to Mirror's Edge in the comics, which I did with DC. It was a 6-parter, and it was all about how Faith became a runner and her relationship with Kate and her family, and how that.
For the record, is different with what EA decided to
yeah,
go with their sequel prequel.
I haven't played Catalyst, and I wasn't involved with it at all, so I don't know how different it is. But I think they took some influences from the comics, I believe. But yeah, that's kind of where I did it first, because originally the team were talking about doing a sequel to Mirror's Edge, like straight after the original one. That never happened, obviously.
I wish it did.
Well, I mean, in the comics, I could do a lot more of what I would have done in the game if I'd been in earlier, or encouraged the team to do, and that was kind of explore who their clients were, what they were transporting, and the ramifications of that. And because of where I came in with the game, and because of the gameplay that was there, you have to work with what you have, and that's how games writing works. You get this box of narrative body parts pushed across the table to you when you start, and you don't know what it's going to be. It might be some art, it might be some backstory, it might be just a few notes. There might be some bios there, and you just have to piece it all together and fill in the gaps. And it's a very strange way of working, but it can be really challenging.
And instead, with something like Overlord, you were brought in for the entire design of the thing, right? Like I got the impression that it was more like an involved process in creating the dynamics of the game, or was it more like these other cases?
It wasn't quite as developed when I came in. So I think they had. So I think they may have been in development for a year. Maybe a bit less than that when I came on board, and they had a sort of rough structure, and they had some rough ideas of characters, and I think my sense of humour just sort of worked with theirs well, and it sort of all came together, and I worked very closely with the different team members.
So it was already a parody when you got to the project?
Yeah. So
okay.
in a kind of broad way,
right.
Very broad. So the kind of levels and details weren't there.
Like they didn't know what it was a parody of, but they knew it was a parody of something.
Oh no, they knew what it's a parody of, but they had the level design because of the Seven Deadly Sins theme. So they kind of had that, but they didn't really have and they had a few ideas on the heroes, and then I sort of pulled everything together. I mean, it was still a pulling together gig, but it wasn't quite as far along as Mirror's Edge was, and because it was a smaller team, I could work directly with the level designers. So it was much more collaborative in terms of, I could talk to them about what I wanted to do with the narrative. They would talk to me about their levels and where they needed space to introduce some new gameplay mechanics or an enemy or a boss, and then I would structure the script for their levels, and it meant that they were given a script that worked for their level immediately, not they had to change their level to support script or vice versa. And it meant that by the time the script had to get signed off by the creative director, he knew that the person that was going to have to sweat to put that script in there had already been involved in it and had felt that they were invested in it, and I think that was very important.
Talking about these things, like the next topic that comes to my mind is something that I think most of this public of fans, but also colleagues and people that are working in games is, and what I'm interested in as a creator too, is the different job that a writer has compared to a narrative designer. How would you differentiate between those, and how was your experience working in both roles? Because as you said, like you had experiences of just being writing and working with the narrative design.
I think when a writer's being used best, they are doing some narrative design as well. I mean, I've worked with narrative designers who do write, but aren't writing on a particular project. But they may do like writing in their spare time or something like that. Or I've worked with narrative designers who are contributing to writing. I've worked with narrative designers that are just interested in narrative and want to support that side of the design of the game and don't do writing. But with Overlord, I did a lot of narrative design as well. And narrative design is a lot about the not word bits, the kind of experience, the journey, the ways in which that story interacts with the gameplay and intersects, and the mechanics by which the story is told. So that could be through the level design, through animation, through traditional cinematics, could be through level dialogue, environmental storytelling, and so it's quite broad what a narrative designer does, and they usually have one foot in the camp of writing the narrative and one foot in the design camp. But they're really there to work with the writers to help shape the journey that the player goes on through the game and shape the narrative as a whole, not just what might be traditionally seen as the script. I think writers do need to do that and do need to be involved in that, and that's the word. So the word writer kind of scuppers us a bit, and has in the past, because people have thought, writers word bits, and word bits are cheap and easy, and they can just be put in somewhere down the line. We'll make some space for some words, we'll put them in later. And genuinely, that I'm not joking. That has been the attitude, that writing is something that can be slotted in. And yeah, it is fairly cheap and easy to change a line. But I would say that writing is like the glue that holds all the expensive parts together. So you need to really make sure you're getting that right, because it pulls everything else together. That's one of the reasons that you need to get writers early into the process.
Right, because if the writing is supposed to guide gameplay at any level, if you want to test your game, you cannot have placeholder text for it if it's supposed to be guiding the player.
It's really difficult to playtest story.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I've been in situations where companies have tried to playtest story in the same way that they playtest gameplay or level design, and they're continually bombarding the player with questions about the story and how much they understand at any given point. And that's not really the way in which kind of story unfolds, and it's just not a particularly helpful way of doing it. And also the time between actually writing a line and it being in the game in its sort of full glory with full mo capture and sound and animation, it's a long period of time. In a movie, it's short. You can just shoot a scene, you can watch a scene, you can change the thing.
You can rehearse.
Yeah, and this is like months before you see it in the same way. We had that. We had some issues sometimes on Tomb Raider where people would read the scene and they'll go, "Oh, this is right," and then they see it down the line and it hadn't changed at all. And like, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" And they couldn't, because they weren't used to reading scripts and being able to envisage scenes as they would play out in the game. They just sort of weren't able to kind of see how the scene would be kind of fleshed out, and that's something obviously writers and directors have to do every day. And that's one of the issues the industry is grappling with, in that we all have to become better storytellers, because everything within a game contributes to the story. The animation, the art, the level design, the mechanics, it all contributes to the story, whether you're consciously doing it or not. Players, we're storytelling creatures. We will look for the story in everything.
Do you have a trajectory that you think that we're going towards in these terms, or at least what you would wish we would do to have better integration of story and gameplay in the future?
I think we are getting there. There's been a huge improvement just in the time that I've been in the industry. When I started out as a journalist, and then sort of just moving into story development very lightly to start with. People were actually asking the question of whether games needed professional writers. It was like, we've got professional artists and programmers and everything. Why would you not have a professional doing something in your professional product?
Sorry, even artists is still kind of taboo, hiring artists that are not game artists. Yeah. So it's even wider problem. Please continue. And
so it was through this sort of course, the last decade and a half, the industry sort of decided that it's probably a good idea to hire professional writers if they want sort of better stories. And there's been a lot of teething trouble with how to fit writers into the rest of the development team. Like, how do they work, basically? How do kind of writers work? What do they need to know? Who do they need to interact with? And it's a two-way street as well. Writers need to be able to understand game design lightly, it helps if you're kind of understanding what everyone else is fighting for. I mean, I do know some writers that don't really play games, but I really think that if you're a game writer, you should play games, because if you're a movie writer, you watch movies and you read screenplays. It's kind of all about respect for the medium and kind of understanding how things fit together. And sort of coming from a journalist background, that's definitely helped me kind of understand how everything is put together.
I think we're also kind of like missing a vocabulary to communicate between designers and programmers and writers, because like when I'm working on a narrative game, there is always this moment where we're struggling trying to explain to the writer what cannot be done. Yeah. And just having the useful words to say, oh, we can't do this. This is impossible. And they were like, why? Just because we're not trained, like we're not used to working together in that. So I was wondering what's the kind of like process for, I mean, now I guess you're very used to know what can be done and what cannot be done, but like when you work with designers and programmers that are not used to working with a writer, how do you approach that at first? Like, how do you tell them the kind of freedom that they have, understand the kind of freedom that you have?
That's usually not down to me. It'll usually be a couple of levels above my pay grade. So it'll be sort of down to maybe the creative director or the narrative director if the game has one. And a lot of it will depend on the genre of game you're working on and when you've been brought in as a writer. So if you're being brought in at the end, what you can do is going to be very limited. That's why I coined the term narrative paramedic a long time ago, because that's the sort of thing you would be asked to do. You get involved in the last 6 months, and you were basically polishing up a script that had been written by someone else. If you were lucky, it was a writer. If you weren't, it was just someone who had the time to do it, and no one had paid attention to it, and it had just been sort of ripped apart by the rigors of development, and it kind of made no sense, and you were just trying to patch it up and make it live, and that's incredibly difficult and soul-destroying to do. So getting writers in early is something that every game writer will bang on about, because we're still not involved early enough. We need to be involved in pre-production. It doesn't have to be like all the way through the process, but just so that we can bring narrative sensibilities, and a lot of what writers need to do in games is invisible work. It's the body of the iceberg that's below the water. It's kind of figuring out all the why questions, and why is the world like this? Why are you moving through it? What does that mean for the character? What does that mean for the world? How does that mechanic play into the narrative? And if you've got a writer or a narrative designer or someone that's focused on that in the early stages, then that's going to save you a lot of time later. And also there's sort of narrative sensibilities of the team as well, like how much they kind of care about narrative, and time and budget. So you could come onto a project and you find that all the budget's gone because they paid a Hollywood writer loads and loads of money to do a draft of the script, and it didn't work at all, and now some poor game writer's been drafted in to just patch it all up. So a lot of it is experience. I mean, a lot more studios are employing writers in-house now. So whereas I'd often be, when I first started out, I'd often be the only writer on a project. Like Overlord is entirely written by me, down to like weapon and item text. Every bit is written by me. But something like Tomb Raider had 2 writers. Rise of Tomb Raider had 4. And even though that's quite small when compared to things like The Witcher or the Assassin's Creed games, having another person there to kind of bounce ideas off, and who gets it, and who is embedded in the team. So more often than not, I'd be the writer, the external writer. And external writers are really useful because they can get really deep into the scenes and put all their creative efforts into it, and they're not bogged down in like in an office environment, or the politics of kind of working in an office environment as well. And so they can just focus on the pure creativity and the character development. So I'm often getting situations where I'm working with writers and narrative designers who are in-house, and then they're using writers externally to do a lot of the heavy lifting on the scenes, because they're just it's more conducive to a writer to be in your own kind of environment rather than being in an office where everyone's sort of stopping by your desk to ask you questions. That makes writing very difficult.
You briefly mentioned genre before, and I was thinking in films and books and literature, genre usually describes the kind of story, but in games, genre describes the kind of gameplay, and it's usually then pasted to different settings, which serves as the literary genre. So would you say that there is a way to write for shooters compared to a way to write for other kind of games in the game genres, or is it more about the kind of story that you're telling?
It's difficult with shooters. Shooters are becoming very difficult to write for, because I think we're running out of stories to tell about protagonists that just shoot people in the face the whole time. And it's, we've become very... I love a good shooter. That I'm not, like, I love a good shooter. But they are difficult because in kind of movie telling, action equals character, except that action in games is decided by a whole different department that doesn't care if it doesn't equal character. They just care that it's going to be fun for the player, as it should be. So you're dealing with the thing that's going to most define your character is out of your control. So that's very difficult. So you've got to sort of again work backwards from the action to what that means for the character. And again, that's very difficult to do, but it's something I always try and start with mirrors. They're just, okay, she's running. So like, why is she running? What's she running away from? What's she really running away from? What would make her stop and actually fight? And all the things that the kind of act of actually running away as part of your job is going to kind of say about the intricacies of your character. And something like Garrett as well, living on the outskirts of the city, always kind of watching the city and never really being involved and feeling like an outsider. And actually, I think I've had possibly 1 or 2 fan letters about Thief, which is lovely because, again, it's like I say, it's not one I talk about that much. Who's saying from autistic gamers who have said, Garrett is me, that's exactly how I feel about the world. I'm always on the outskirts looking in, and it really resonated with him, which pretty much made my time on a difficult project worthwhile, just knowing that it kind of resonated with people, I think. Shooters are very difficult, and they're becoming very difficult because of that action. I think it's very difficult to line up that action with character, really. I think
motivation.
Spec Ops: The Line, for example, I think did a good job of kind of exploring the psychology of warfare and that kind of thing. But there's only so many times you can do that. So I think it's down to the industry to try and expand on verbs a bit.
But now you're working on a non-genre game, or rather a narrative game like a purely narrative game for the first time. Do you want to tell us about it?
So it sort of it literally involves. It's all about words, and we're still sort of wrestling with it.
The game's called Lost Word.
It's called Lost Words at the moment. Whether it'll stay that, I'm not sure. Lost Words is the working title, but you sort of play the game halfway, half in. It's a sort of younger game. It's halfway in the journal of a young girl and halfway in the fantasy world of her own creation. And it's sort of she's kind of going through the loss of her grandmother who gets sick and dies, and it's all about her processing death and grief in the real world and in her diary. And then she has a story that she's been writing, that she started writing for her gran. That sort of starts to mirror the stages of grief that she's going through in the real world. And in the diary section, you're actually sort of playing along the lines of her diary, so you're sort of running the character along, and the words and the sentences form puzzles, and you have to use different words on different elements of the page to open something or gain access to something. Or doodles, like you might have to use a doodle of a watering can on an acorn to make it grow into a tree to push you up to a different platform and things like that. And The kind of fantasy world is more of a side scroller, but you're sort of collecting words, and then you can use these words to cause different things to happen in the environment, like cause a fire or melt snow. So you're doing all kinds of things there, but it's still sort of kind of early on in development, and it's quite it's quite challenging. But it's just a little kind of smaller indie project, but because it's so narrative, it's narrative based as is gameplay as well, which is very, very challenging. But that's the only game I'm working on at the moment. So I was working on the Suicide Squad game that got cancelled, which I think I can say because it's got cancelled, and no one knew about it until it got cancelled. But that was really fun to work on. It wasn't my fault, by the way, I think. But it was a really fun game, and I would have loved to have seen it out there, and it's really fun working on those characters. But yeah, Lost Words is the only game I'm working on at the moment. There's a few kind of nibbles out there, but I'm more doing sort of film and TV stuff at the moment.
Okay, but you started a studio to make this game, right? So you've kind of like gone full indie for this title.
No, it's not my studio. It's someone else.
You just participated in the project.
Yeah. I just met the guy that runs Sketchbook Games is the studio, and Mark Backler is the guy that runs it. So I just met him. He won an indie jam that I was judging. That's how I met him the first time, actually. And yeah, we just sort of kind of got involved, and I had some ideas, and it all kind of went from there. Yeah, I'd be very scared to start a studio just because I know how much work that goes into it, and I'd like a life.
Yes, definitely. Terrifying. So, do you see yourself in the future, and after Lost Words and after the TV work that you're doing, to be coming back to games more in the AAA side, or trying smaller, more narrative projects, or maybe something in between?
I don't know. I'm an amphibious writer, therefore I go where the interesting stories are and where the challenges are. And so, yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons I sort of went towards film and TV, is because I think it strengthens me as a writer. And I'm learning new storytelling techniques and kind of working with, professionals at the top of their game, which is wonderful. And then, although I've done the same in games as well, the narrative literacy of the games industry is lower than that of film and TV. Just, it's not being mean, it's just never had to be that high because storytelling hasn't been the priority, where it's been, the priority more or less in other mediums. But that is getting better. More people on the team are kind of embracing story and looking at ways that their particular discipline, be it art or level design or mechanics, can help support the story and the journey of the characters. That does mean that I give up power for freedom. So I've never gone in-house because I don't want to be tied down to one project. So I like the freedom of being able to work on multiple projects, be they film, TV, comics, games, because I think that strengthens me as a writer and bringing on those challenges. But I think you have to be a particular type of personality for that to work for. And yeah, that's just really worked for me. So it's where the answer is where the challenges are, where the interesting stories are to be told. If they're in games, great.
Speaking of challenges, trick question. Do you believe in procedural narrative?
I think it's possible. I think there are. It's sort of. Do you mean sort of things like Masquerade, or do you mean sort of more systemic narrative? So, I mean, I have done a bit of work on systemic narrative and kind of evolving narrative, and it is quite hard to do. I think it's one interesting way of doing it. I think a lot of these things come along and people act like it will maybe change the whole industry, and it won't. It'll just be a different, subset of it. And I think there's people doing some interesting things with procedural and systemic narrative that I think are really adding to the experience. I mean, I don't think it's going to take anything over, but I think interesting things will come of it. The same with VR as well.
And would you be interested in working on a project that tackles that?
I have done a little bit of work in the past, and I think it is hard, and actually, particularly with systemic, it does involve a lot of work with a writer to try and make sure that everything that is pulled, the system fits together is going to make sense. I mean, I don't think machines are going to completely replace writers, thankfully, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of where the stories, you know, there's so much potential the games industry has to explore themes and you know, different lives and say something about the world and our experiences of it. And we are starting to do that a lot more, particularly in the indie space. And I think that's sort of bleeding upwards to AAA, but you know, I like seeing more kind of personal stories, like things like that Dragon Cancel or like Fragments of Him, that kind of, you know, are kind of more personal and explore kind of what it means to be human and bumbling kind of through the world. And because games often put us in the shoes of someone else, and you know, we are walking a mile in their shoes, there's a lot we can do with kind of empathy and you know, just taking players on journeys of characters that they wouldn't, you know, normally experience. Even with Lara, we got a lot of feedback from male players who just, they were experiencing things as Lara and being a woman and specific fears involved with that they wouldn't have experienced as a man. And they're going, I suddenly realised a bit more about what it's like to move through the world as a woman in a way that I didn't previously, and I wouldn't experience it as a man. And I thought that was really interesting and powerful. So I think there's a lot of stuff we have to do. We're still only sort of scratched the surface as a power that you know, game stories have. So I think we've kind of got quite far in a short space of time in the last sort of, you know, decade and a half. I think we've come on leaps and bounds, but there's still a lot to do, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was super interesting. I think we're not doing questions, or we're not. So thank you, guys. Hope you enjoy.